Welcome! In this video, we're going to talk about engaging the hip. So the phrase engage the hip is so ubiquitous in martial arts that it can have so many different meanings. So just like with another like swordy phrase like, oh, push pull with the sword in order to cut, is so used that sometimes it's kind of hard to like break it apart and really digest what's really trying to teach. Because it's going to be different for most martial arts, right? So you're going to be engaging the hip differently from an open hand position as opposed to like a sword position or a weapons position. Even then, right? So even within a weapons, martial art, you're going to be engaging the hips a little bit differently potentially than like if you're doing like a one-handed strike as opposed to a two-handed strike. So within reason, there's going to be a lot of different types of interpretation. So in this video, we're not going to necessarily say like this is the right way or like the wrong way, blah, blah, blah. I just want to introduce a few different ways to reconceptualize the idea so you can kind of have a little bit more of a foundation to kind of engage with. One interpretation is when I say hip, you might be thinking about like the actual sides of the body like so, right? So this is going to be particularly useful if you're thinking about like twisting and stuff like that, potentially for something like a punch or like a one-handed thrust or something like that. So one way for you to kind of conceptualize this is like if I'm trying to face down someone here, if I want to throw again that happy little number 2, right? So our rear hand punch, what you might be thinking about doing is like engage like the side of the hip. I want to kind of like twist it such that I'm able to like move my shoulders also in the twisting motion in order to kind of get a little bit more follow through. Sure, right? Same thing with if we're actually doing like a thrust or something like that, right? And if I'm kind of here, again, I like to think about this in terms of a one-handed motion. So if you are thinking about like in the sides of the hip, we can kind of twist as a maybe thrust with a thrust, right? With a stab, right? Or even like if we're trying to do like kind of like a thrusting motion this way, pushing off the side of the hip to really get more of a thrust that way. So there's a lot of different ways to think about that particular aspect, but I do want to kind of warn against aspects of it. So one major reason is if you're very surface level thinking about the hips, you're going to kind of lose a lot of the power generation in another interpretation we'll talk about next, right? So if you think about just twisting the hips in order to get more power, you probably will get some power if there is like a horizontal vector to your motion, right? So for example, if we're doing like a cross cut from here, I can use that hip a little bit, kind of drive through if I really want to, right? I'm over exaggerating a little bit to kind of get a little bit of that follow through. Also kind of gave away a key phrase there, but this is really good for following through with something. So if you are dealing with a sword and cuts and stuff like that, using again the idea of the side of the hips, again this is like the side of the hips, using that twisting motion, whether it's like twisting horizontally this way or twisting more on angle, kind of follow through with a cut. That idea of that particular way of using the hip is good for, again, following through so you don't get like jammed into the body. You kind of like follow through with cuts this way. But there are going to be drawbacks. These drawbacks are specifically when we're dealing with a two-handed sword like this one. These are not drawbacks if you're dealing with one-handed or with sticks or with knives or anything like that. But specifically with a two-handed sword like this one, when we do think that twisting motion as we cut, if I twist too much, yes, I'll be able to follow through, so it's a little more of a slashing motion. But if I'm trying to make impact with someone like, so for you, dear listener, if I'm trying to strike you here, but if I'm following through more with my hip, as opposed to another interpretation I'm going to be dealing with in a little bit, I'm just going to be like, which will be more obvious from the side, right? I'll be here, kind of following through. Noticing that the range is not that much, right? Again, this is absolutely fine if we're kind of dealing with it from like a one-handed sword perspective. We're following through, again, with the slashing motions here, right? That will be fine because, again, you're trying to, again, not get caught, and it's more about speed as opposed to power. But that's just one interpretation of the phrase, again, engage your hip. So another way to do it is actually think about, again, where all those muscles and bone, right? So if you think about like the actual like ball and socket joint, think about where those muscles actually like attach to the hip. So as opposed to something very surface, again, like the sides of the hip here, we can kind of like twist as we kind of move that way. Think about again, the stuff that's like inside of the actual hip. So when you think about something like that, so even doing the same thing as we did before with that punch, right? So if we're here and I'm just using the surface level hip, yes, I can get that follow through. I can really get that reach if I really want to, but it's not going to be as powerful as opposed to if I really use the muscles inside of the hip. So when I talk about, again, using your glute, for example, it's kind of like a combination of these two things. Again, the actual like massive muscle inside, using that kind of like really push in with that number 2 punch here, right? You're going to get a lot more of that flex, a little bit more of that core activation, and still having that twisting motion to really push with that punch. It's going to be the same thing with our other motions, right? So this is a little bit more obvious with that, the thrust actually had a third here before. So if we're doing something, again, similar to rapier, if I'm just using the twist of the hip here, sure, right? But if I'm using, again, the hip that's inside of the muscles inside the hip, right? Here, I can actually use that whole motion to really push with that thrust. Same thing pushing back, right? Again, using that hip, kind of like almost like suck in the front leg, kind of pull back into some sort of guard. So when you think about hip, you can also think about like what's inside of the hip and kind of what can drive you in a more linear motion. You can probably tell that this is the one I'm a little bit more biased for, right? So again, full transparency. So this is the one that I like a little bit more for my two-handers, right? So the main reason for that is when you think about, again, the muscle inside of the hip. Again, if you're thinking about the glutes attached to it, and you know the front of the hip as well, like the core, this is going to give you very powerful, again, more linear motion. For me personally, I find it easier to focus on the linear and then kind of add in the angular later, because for me, naturally, just adding in angularity is a little bit easier to kind of add in last moment, right? So for example, if we are doing that same cutting combination, right? So if we're here, if I'm only twisting, right? Not a lot of power. I mean, you can generate a lot of power, but it's going to be more about, again, speed maybe, but again, not range. Again, same thing. So this is the same as number 1. Again, using that hip, kind of follow through. However, if I engage that glute a little bit more and really drive more back here, right? I'm going to get a lot more power with my strike and a lot more range. As you can imagine, if I actually did make contact, wha-bang, I'm probably going to be stuck. So that's the thing about linear motion. So our body was, I'm going to make a very gross overstatement, but our bodies were really good with that linear motion. So again, think about how we evolved. We evolved, running in very linear motion this way. Again, using that glute and everything kind of moving forward. But obviously we can still do our twists. But that's also the difference between a cut and a slash, again, according to my random my random nitpicking, right? So like this, again, using, again, the muscle inside the hip to really drive forward with a cut is going to be nice and powerful, but again, it's going to get stuck. Versus if I did a more of a slash, it would be easier to kind of follow through with a twisting motion, just so I can kind of, again, not get stuck. So, as you can probably imagine, which one of these is better? Both. Do both. Again, you can do it at the same time, right? So the hip is a very big collection of muscles and bones and, again, a lot of mass. So it's a really good place for you to, again, focus when we're doing a lot of either open hand or weapons kind of things, right? So when we do a punch, for example, if I only use the hip, I'm doing this because I'm also doing my glute. If I only use it in a linear motion, it doesn't really do much, right? Versus if I do, again, just hips, I can maybe get further, but it's both, right? If I do both the linear motion as well as the hip motion, I can get a lot more power with my striking. So there's going to be a few other kind of like random things at the end, but that's going to be the main idea again of engaging the hip. But we like our random stuff, right? So the main thing here is also like how you visualize how you're engaging with the hip. So even when I was doing again that number 2 punch, so think about your hips almost like a board. Again, for now, just for simplicity's sake, right? So think about a board like this. Again, like maybe like where it meets the bottom of the leg versus where it comes up here, where it meets the belt. Here, and then kind of following through. What you can do is think about that one board just swishing back and forth, and you can still get a decent amount of power and stuff like that. But also think about like the way you can kind of like twist that board up, right? So like if you're doing a lot of maybe like even like an uppercut punch, right? Or an uppercut with a sword, because this is a sword channel, right? We will do that. But if you think about like in that board, kind of twisting on the side and pushing up this way, right? So with an open hand, if I just did only horizontal with an uppercut punch, it's okay. But if I kind of like twist it so that like one portion is a little bit higher than the other, it's also like a little more twisted this way, you can get a lot more power with that strike. Again, same thing with uppercuts, right? So with a sword. So if I only did hip, or only did a horizontal motion, that's okay. Versus again, if I kind of twist that board a little bit, so like the angularity of the hip, you're kind of like dipping one portion underneath the other, it's going to be a lot more powerful. But again, that depends on the type of move you're using. The third way you can also engage your hip is not necessarily in a twisting motion to again generate power. We can also use it to be more stable. So a stance that, when you look at many different sitting stances, right, or horse riding stances, they all have very different functions, right? So when you look at, for example, Haidong Gumdo's kimase, right, so our sitting stance, it's not the typical, again, kind of like here, right, which you kind of see a lot more with open hand. So it's not just a deep squat. It's actually more back here. Again, you're rolling the hip back. Why do you roll the hip back, right? Because it's not necessarily going to give you more power per se, right? Because like this is sort of like deactivated from like, so for example, as opposed to like in a longer stance like this, it is, however, going to be extremely stable, right? So with the hips kind of deactivated, but I won't say deactivated, but rolled back, it'll be harder to engage them with an actual cut like this, but it's going to add many layers of stability, right? So like when you're here, as you're pulling it back, noticing again my back's going to be nice and stable. As I'm pulling up, it's going to be a nice place for me to kind of like to have my core kind of grounded. And as I'm pulling it in, you can have a nice, again, very stable cut. So as you're going through forms and as you're going through, again, sparring or anything like that, think about how you're using your hip. Again, how not just in the sense of, are we twisting it? Are we using it to be stable? But also, where is your mind wandering when you're actually going through it? Like, is your mind at the top of the hip, where it's kind of like moving this way? Is it like right behind, like for example, like one of the ball sockets as I'm moving in with a punch or something like that? Be aware. But with that, make sure you stay safe, stay humble, and keep training.